Welcome back to SheCan, where women role models lead by example by telling their stories to support others because it's easier to be what you can see. And I'm very excited to talk to Dr. Cindy Frewen today. Cindy, welcome to SheCan. You're an architect.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
You're an architect and urban futurist and adjunct professor at the University of Houston. You run the graduate program in Strategic Foresight. You're also a writer, a keynote speaker, and a consultant on urbanization, future cities, design futures, and you specialize at the intersection of people, technology, and environment. You also serve on the board of the Kansas City Design Center and the University of Kansas School of Architecture, Design, and Planning. You have designed countless sustainable schools, police facilities, courthouses, fire stations, parks, zoos, and housing development. Your journey from architect to futurist is a really interesting one, Cindy. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got to where you are today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. Stephanie, we've worked for a couple of months to get this interview time period, and I'm just so happy to be here with you and fascinated to hear your take on things, and your questions are really amazing, really interesting. So this first one about this pivotal points, I think is how you worded it to me in your question. Really, there was three major changes that I made over the course of a 50-year career. It's what happens when you're 69, you get a long, long career. But in the 70s, it was very unusual for women to be architects in America. And so when I had a schizophrenic brother who committed suicide, and when I was 15, almost 16. And when I lost him, I thought, you can ruin your life so fast. It's gone so fast. You have to decide how you're going to use it. And I became quite focused. I went from, being probably sort of a normal kid doing normal things to being really driven and deciding that I needed to know what to do. And immediately within a week decided to be an architect. Went through some tests, said I should be a farmer and architect. And then the school told me I should be an interior designer because women weren't really architects. So it was a very pivotal decision to say, yes, that sounds like a challenge I want to take. And it sounds like something I'll be good at. And I'm fascinated by it. It turns out, as you look at the threads of life, I find a lot of things that sent me in that direction. And so it was very easy for me to make that choice and move forward on it. The next decision, though, was a few years, about 10 years later, deciding to open my own firm. Again, now this is early 80s, and women weren't opening businesses very rapidly, and especially not in a male-dominated field like architecture. And so again, I heard a lot of naysayers saying, this is a bad idea, it's gonna sure to fail. And I said, well, then I'll go back to work for someone else. But in the meantime, let's try it. And I gravitated rather rapidly to public work. Within 2 years, I was starting to do parks projects or a variety of different public projects, schools, public housing. And I found that to be so much more gratifying than doing commercial projects or residential projects. Though not that you can have great careers in those too, but I love the public space. I feel like it has a lot of value. You can bring meaning to your work, and I love doing it. So my business really thrived. I owned it for 20 or 25 years, if you count the merger time period. I really kind of at a peak of it, and we started doing a lot larger public projects. The more that I got involved in large scale projects, like one of them was 60 blocks of downtown Kansas City, Missouri, where my office was located. As I was doing that, I started realizing we just didn't know enough to make decisions to inform our clients. We were making a lot of decisions on aesthetics or on our feel of things, but our information was, I felt, very limited of how we would decide what we were going to build. And so at that point, I said, well, then because my company was at sort of a peak, it was a good time to sell, merge it with another firm, and decided to go into long-term forecasting, the strategic futures work that I do now. And so that was around 2002 to 2007. I had to go through a PhD program. I mean, it was a number of years, quite a transition. So that's a third pivotal point, was deciding in my 40s, I was going to make a really dramatic change, which was a good decision because it gives you new life. It's the same thing. I told my architecture friends, I'm just graduating to a different form of doing architecture. I'm still doing architecture. I'm just designing whole cities, thinking about the whole city instead of one building at a time. And so these have all been really pivotal moments. I think each one of them have been important.
Cindy, it's fascinating to listen to your expanding vision and really the root moment of how this all came about. So tell us a bit more about your insights, Cindy. What is the future of design, housing, and social change? These are all things you think about all the time.
This is a century of what you would call a peak moment, peak population, peak urbanization, peak oil. We're hoping in America, peak bad food. There's a lot of peaks, things that we were doing in the industrialization, which is really just, a few hundred years when you think of 10,000 years of civilization. And just a few hundred of them have been with machines and with energy the way that we use it now. Cities are really a function of about 1850 when we got indoor plumbing, thanks to Colic in London, that they finally figured out to quit, throwing dead bodies, throwing the toxins into the very water they were drinking. And so it's not even 200-year-old field of knowledge, the idea of growing cities. And in that same time period, the population spiked, the hockey stick population growth, where it went from, some odd millions and maybe a billion people to now 8 billion people. And, but again, population is peaking in this century. So changing that, how it peaks, it means there's fewer younger people and more older people. And so that's and we don't really know how to do growth, how to do prosperity really without growth. We've always depended on more and more and more. And instead we have to figure out how do you do quality, even when the working middle class might be shrinking, and it's just quite a different phenomena that we're looking at. And then finally, the issues of technology during this century are substantial. People are just now seeing the beginnings of AI, but it has it has a long runway of things that it can do. And you see it a little bit, you see sort of a surface version of it. People start using it, but how much that will integrate into our lives is astonishing. So anyway, it's a very interesting time for people to be looking long-term, which is luckily for me what I do.
Yeah.
It's a very fascinating time.
Cindy, so how do you think we will live together in urban environments going forward?
We have gotten, in the industrial era, we had this idea of segregation, of separating out uses, of putting all the concrete and all the, dams and things to make things the way that humans needed it. We neglected the idea of how do you then make the planet happy? How do you make it function together? And so there's more of a mentality of distribution, both of the people and all of the resources, which are basically food and energy and water. These are the big three resources you have to make a place work that people need. The things that we've done to the earth it has hurt, all kinds of things, but the most at-risk population is us. The earth is very good at repairing itself and regreening itself. If you have been to any places where there's blight and there's ruin, you can see the green growth coming back immediately. It's the buildings that disappear. They, crumble into ruins. But the earth itself is good at healing itself. We're the ones that are at risk. So it's a very, how will we live together? I think it's a combination of needing to become more uh, cognizant of each other on every level and how we're dealing with the planet, how we're dealing with each other. These are skills that we haven't really, how do we live, 100 years? These are skills we aren't developing. We just fall into them, you might say, and yet you have to be much more conscious of what you're doing when there's so many people. And it's complicated. So much easier like 100 years ago when cities were starting to develop, you see these grandiose Jetson-like zoomy cities. But in fact, it turns out it's that whole highway mentality and flying over and all of that. You really just want a garden and a place near you and friends and family. And, it's really much more a soft touch that has to be developed. And so we got sort of, we exaggerated it over to one side, and now we're making a correction.
And I think we need to refine our ways back to connection and community. And what will that look like? And I often think that the Nordic countries in Europe do this quite well. There's a lot of pilot projects in Holland and Sweden and Denmark where you have nurseries and old people's homes, and you connect the young and old, and you get an enormous amount of benefits, both in terms of reduction in costs because you're using the elderly for free for certain things, and you engage them and you build that connection and community. And so it's a sort of circular way of being that some countries do a better job at than some others in trying to rethink the way we live at the moment. What do you think are sort of sustainable ways of planning that we need to adopt ASAP for us and the planet?
Well, that there's like several areas to look at. And one of the things futurists do is divide things out by social, technological, environmental, economic, and political. And so that you make sure you touch all of the bases, because each one of these decisions occupy each of those domains, and to make them work, you have to do all of them. But there's the whole issue of just let's call it the infrastructure of how we live, where we are doing more self-production, doing more things locally that are not with a bunch of processed things, a lot of processed foods, and bringing in water from elsewhere. You can use many environments, you have enough water and such there. You don't need to, go hundreds of miles with big dams to make it work. It's a matter of conserving things properly and making it balance out. Well, that's a sustainable side of things. But also how we, live together. And I love your example, because something really obvious is affordable housing. It's been a real problem around the world. There's places where it's with too many people and not enough housing, and they end up building these informal developments, slums, massive slums, millions of people, a couple of billion people live in these some of them are, especially in India, are middle class, but there is nowhere else to live. They have really nice cars, nice jobs, but they live in these informal developments, which can be raised, bulldozed overnight. This is an inequity. I mean, it's a mess. And every city except a couple have got affordable housing problems. The housing is just too expensive for what money you make in that city. But Helsinki, I think, and Vienna are the two that have figured out, because they made it priority. And so you mentioned the Scandinavians, of course. They're thinking about, they say, zero tolerance for homelessness. They housing first for everyone. And they take their best land, not their worst land, which is where slums are usually on the, in the swamps or on unbuildable slopes. And instead they take their very best land, and then they let people stay there, because then you have mixed income without having to force it. These are how you think systematically, think systems wide across domains, emphasizing here's what our goal is, how do we do it? And those kind of collective visions, they take a generation to happen. And these two cities both started those plans in the 80s and 90s, but they pay off now when no other cities in the whole world have conquered that problem.
Which is why it's so depressing that we have new governments every 4 years that might change course completely, because there's never a long-term vision, Cindy, which is why I'm so fascinated with futurists such as yourself, who basically cook up visions for the future, and then hopefully that trickles down, you know, into the next generation that you teach or that you work with. And so you're sowing those seeds of what better ways could be. Cindy, I'm wondering, if you look back, you're in your end 60s, you've done this a long time. What are your main learnings? What would you say are your sort of main takeaways?
One of them is just the idea of how long it takes things to happen, to the patience it takes. We used to build a blueprint, you might say, a master plan. I mean, even has sort of a patriarchal term to it. A master plan is that a top-down thinking, but instead, most of it is about the process of educating people and getting them to co-create things at the same time, and bringing in the multitude of, the various viewpoints. So you don't shun some and favor others, and that people are represented. So then they buy in. In Aruba, they did a plan that was 15 or 20 years. They did it about 2007, 8, something like that. And they said they were too reliant on snowbirds from the US, and they were too reliant on coal. And they figured out it was a huge public participation project. Almost like 100,000 people got involved because of how they did it. One person teaching another, building another group. Is very grassroots. And the amazing thing was that they got done with their plans like 5 or 10 years early. They're already done with their 2025 plan 5 years ago. Wow. And it's because it wasn't just that they bought in, but they acted on it. And so the public, resources that came to it were bolstered by how people actually used the place. And I think that we build something, but then people use it and it changes it. And it's very important to see that adapting. So that the long-term, recognizing the long-term and recognizing it's all incremental, and it's all about having so many people involved, and that's a good thing. The different viewpoints, you just have to say, there's even brain scans that show that people with different viewpoints are using different parts of their brain. So they're hearing you and I listening to the same story might hear a very different idea. Which is the final thing I would like to say is that whenever I do go to a city, the first thing you do is start asking what their stories are, because it's always based on who they are and what they care about, and that what matters most to them. Those are probably my largest, especially in my field. Now, those are not generic, how do you do business? How do you work with people? Those are these are more specific to my work.
Definitely. So, Cindy, what top tips would you have for young architects or planners?
Well, this idea of thinking beyond one building at a time, and thinking beyond even just the fields that we see, so that you incorporate different classes, different points of view, different concerns. Many cities are planned around transportation. And who wants a car-based city anyway? It's human-based. And so you have to think about people first, and think about a city that children want to live in, a city that older people want to live in, cities that singles and families. It's important that it is cities for everyone. And how do you do that? And so I think the communication skills, a lot of people that are in design are introverted, and that's good to have that skill. And so recognizing there's some people that are good at looking at short term, there's some people that are good at visioning, and there's some people that are good at connecting them and trying to bring in each of those different ways of thinking matters, and knowing who you are in that process, and more than anything else, to know who you are.
Cindy, I love your vision of inclusivity here, and I think that's exactly what it is. And we know that as a business case, that has a better output. And the same thing is for our spaces, the spaces we inhabit. Cindy, so what would you say matters to you most, and how do you want to matter? You know, you're in a life stage where you can think about legacy, you can think about how you want to matter. What would you say? Can you tell us a little bit about your vision?
When I was way younger, I was probably in my 40s at the time, someone asked me, what would you write on your tombstone? I said, well, first of all, I don't think I'll have a tombstone, but at the same time, when you build buildings, having a tombstone isn't so significant, because you already have left your mark on the earth, you might say, in so many ways, both the buildings I've built and the ones that I've torn down. I mean, when you do public work, you do both demolition and construction, and dozens, if not hundreds, of buildings. And so you may already make that mark on earth. But it's amazing when I think about what I did, because I also was architecture, and then the futures work and the teaching, and the large scale strategic thinking. But one of the things that has been most important to me, and also I ran this group, the Association of Professional Futurists, for about 7 years, in the last decade. And that was really significant to me, because, growing that group and growing our community, global community, has been very significant to me. But then I got into some family caregiving, because my parents were older, and my late husband were too, and they, for about 7 or 8 years, were in the center of my life. And then a workaholic like me was able to, I still could do some work, but I had to alter my work dramatically so that I could take care of every operation and every doctor's appointment. And that turned out to be so important to me as a person, to get a chance to do that as service, really family service. Because I didn't have kids, and I was very driven and very ambitious and very workaholic all the time, working 100-hour work weeks regularly. And then to take that step back, and my friends, it all became a more full life for someone that had been really focused, to then find out that, in fact, I could be human too, was good. Before, my idea of a hobby was serving on a board or doing some nonprofit work. But then to serve my family, it turned out to be so significant to me. It's very meaningful. They all 3 passed in about a 10-month time period in 2020, 2021. And so it was significant change to then find myself suddenly single and widowed, and trying to figure out what you do when you've been so involved in caregiving. But that, amazingly, when I think about things that I did in my life, that was the most important.
Beautiful, Cindy. Thank you for saying that. So if you had a direct line to the White House, what would you tell them about your future visions of, architecture, design, the spaces we inhabit, housing?
Well, there's a thing called futures literacy, which is about thinking long term. It's sort of like other literacies, where you learn how to balance a checkbook, or you learn how to read a book, or you learn how to do math, but we don't really learn how to think 100 years out. And yet many of us will live to be 100 years. And we have no concept of how to do that. And so I think the first thing is to help them learn to think further out than the next, fiscal report or the next budget report they have to do, but what is really the casualties of the decisions we make today, and where is that going? Where does that head? I just find that very lacking, the longest term thinking. I don't know. It needs to be some component of every single thing that they're doing, because they have such implications. And I always think in terms of consequences, and what's this one for, first term consequences versus fifth and sixth and seventh round, looking further out. If we do this, then this might happen. And it's a hard game to play, but it's significant, should make very meaningful changes to how they would think, I think, if they were actually considering how their grandkids are going to live. What are they actually, what's the legacy that they're leaving? Right now, they're busy on creating a debt that is, historic, and it's making a difference to people every day. My next door neighbor, who does education consulting, found out she lost her job that she was doing on an Indian reservation, a Native American Indian reservation here in the U.S., and she got let go because of the cancellations. These have long-term implications. Education is one of those long-term things. It's an investment in the next generation. So I think those, starting with, being non-judgmental about it, but starting with let's think about where this is really heading. It's not about 2025, it's about 2050 and 2075.
Yeah, I feel if I look at our times, we somehow lost the long-term view, and we lost this idea that we are all here for the greater good, that you get elected for 4 or 8 years, but you are not, it's not about you, it's about the greater service that you do on this planet, Earth, and the idea that you are here to facilitate things for the future, which I think we used to have. We didn't used to have this cult around the person. We saw it in a different way, as if it's a person that's facilitating a framework that we put into place, where he was trying to do the right thing. And I understand the current government also thinks they're doing the right thing, but they're certainly not doing it with a long-term view, and they're certainly not doing it for the greater good. And so I feel those are things we've lost, and I often wonder, how can we get them back, where we all agree that we have to pay a little rent for being here, and that our view has to be more long-term, because it's not working the way it is right now. Cindy, what are your plans and goals? Where do you feel you're heading? How much more do you have in the tank? What's your vision?
When I decided to sort of make this career shift 20 years ago, my whole goal was to be writing. But it turned out there was a lot of immediate things to do. But writing is a long-term process, even though maybe it would take me a couple of years to complete something that I would find of value. And projects that I was working on often would take 7 or 10 years. So you would think I would have the stamina to stick with, but there's so many immediate things that I get hooked into because I find them all so fascinating, like this. And so I do hope, though, that I am able to carve out the attention span to do some publishing and some more publishing. I just wrote a couple of forwards for books this last couple of months. So my friends are all publishing and I'm helping them. But I hope to be part of that group too, besides articles. I do some articles and shorter things, but I still think long form books are of value. I certainly have a few thousand of them myself. So I think they still have a huge value of people focusing on something. So I want to contribute, because it's rare for someone to have had the benefits I've had of being able to go through architecture and business so deeply, and teaching, and then futures thinking. It's a rare combination of information that I think would help people think do the things that we're talking about here today. How do you build community long term? How do you make those connections? And how do you basically use the future for your benefit, and for your future generations' benefits?
Cindy, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking a lot about the interconnectedness of us humans and how it's so important to go back to this concept that we're all humans. It's not about men and women or, whatever we think we are. It's about this interconnectedness and this connection that can propel us forward. So I'm wondering what is the importance of being in a network of futurists worldwide? That you've been leading an organization. How do you feel that? What happens with that connectedness of all these people thinking about big visions for the future?
Yeah, well, I got to tell you, it is fascinating every single day. Right now, there's a thread that I'm watching on tourism. I don't do work on tourism, but some countries depend on it. And the U.S. is falling behind because people are deciding not to come here now. What will happen? I don't know. That will affect a lot of jobs. Again, it will affect people's livelihood. But some countries, Italy and many islands and such, they really depend on it. So listening to them talk about that, I just recently read an article about older people doing all their tourism with the goggles, the AI goggles, and how they can still visit. I in 2017 was at this experimental building they have on Microsoft campus. And they had the goggles, and I went and saw Machu Picchu, and I was terrified of heights at the time. And I said, well, obviously I'm never going to Machu Picchu because I can't stand the height. And because you really felt scared. It was really a visceral experience. And since that time, I have gone there because I managed to get hypnotized to get rid of my fear of heights.
God, I need the number of the person who hypnotized you. That's my one major fear.
It's amazing how many things that affects. I think of it weekly almost of some stares that I would never do this. Oh, I would never do this. Even when I'm riding, I have a horse, and even when I'm riding, that's how I went to Machu Picchu. I rode a horse in there, and so it was very terrifying heights the whole way up. At any rate, the people can then use those. These are things that are going to be available to people, that they'll get to tour, they'll get to do something because of this technology, and they do it together. You see them all, they still feel like they're in a group together going on a tour, and they would never be able to do that. There's amazing things ahead for us. It's not all terrifying. Some of it's really going to be fun. And so there's some real hopeful things for the future. If we manage to work together better, if we manage to appreciate each other fully and think about each other.
Yeah. Cindy, so what would you like our listeners to take away from your story?
Well, if they find any interest at all in the idea of long-term thinking, there's a lot of material from my friends all over the world that have published things, and many people I don't know, and I still learn from how you think better about and not just long-term, but also how you think wide across those domains I mentioned earlier, the social and technological. So you're not just siloed. Many of the education systems and jobs that people go into are so siloed that they don't see across the board. And then thirdly, think deeply about people's stories and what they care about. I call that three-dimensional thinking, is that if you think about all those different dimensions, you can actually become a systems thinker and a more holistic thinker about your own life and about your work, about what you're doing, what your contributions are.
Dr. Cindy Frewen, I'm so excited to have you on SheCan. Thank you so much for your story and insights and this incredible 3D thinking that you mentioned at the end now, and your putting people first vision that I think is so unbelievably important to create a better and more inclusive world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.